Hey guys! Tonight we're going to do something very gentle, very quiet, and deeply unfortunate for several royal bloodlines. So dim the lights, put your phone face down, loosen your jaw, and let your brain slowly power down as we float through centuries of people who absolutely should not have married their cousins, but very enthusiastically did anyway. This is a story about crowns, castles, and the kind of family trees that look less like trees and more like tangled headphone wires at the bottom of a medieval pocket. No battles tonight, no exciting twists, just a long parade of elites making deeply questionable reproductive decisions and then acting shocked when it goes badly, because of course they did. We'll begin, as so many genetic cautionary tales do, in Europe, specifically in the part of Europe where everyone was related, everyone knew it, and everyone pretended it was fine. Let's drift back to the late Middle Ages, when royal marriage wasn't about love or compatibility or even basic tolerance. It was about land and treaties and making sure your cousin didn't invade you unless you married them first. For medieval royalty, marriage was less "till death do us part" and more "please don't annex my kingdom." Romance was optional. Proximity in the family tree was not. The church technically frowned on close-kin marriages, on paper, but the church also loved money and influence, so dispensations were handed out like napkins. Too closely related? No problem. Just write a letter to Rome, wait a bit, and voila! Suddenly, your niece is an acceptable political partner. God works in mysterious ways, very convenient ways. And nowhere was this embraced more enthusiastically than by the Habsburgs. Ah, yes, the Habsburgs. If European history were a long, quiet warning label, their family portrait would be printed in bold. The Habsburg strategy was simple. Why marry strangers when you can keep everything in the family? Why risk new blood when you can recycle the old blood repeatedly until it becomes whatever that was? Their motto, unofficially, might as well have been, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did. Cousins, second cousins, uncles and nieces, aunts and nephews. If there was a vaguely shared grandparent somewhere in the mist, they considered it destiny. This approach worked politically. For a while. The Habsburgs collected territories like trading cards. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy. They were everywhere. And increasingly, they all looked the same. Which brings us gently, softly to Charles II of Spain, a man who looks like the final boss of inbreeding. Charles was born in 1661, which already put him at a disadvantage medically. But genetically, oh boy. By the time Charles arrived, his family tree had folded in on itself so many times that it barely qualified as a tree anymore, more of a wreath or a decorative knot. His parents were uncle and niece, which means his grandparents were also his great-grandparents, and his great-great-grandparents kept reappearing like recurring characters in a very confusing sitcom. Modern geneticists have looked at Charles's lineage and quietly whispered things like "how" and "why," and "this explains a lot." Charles was described as weak, sickly, and developmentally delayed. He didn't walk until he was 4, he didn't speak until he was 8. His jaw, now famously known as the Habsburg jaw, protruded so dramatically that chewing was a lifelong challenge. Eating for Charles was less a pleasure and more a logistical negotiation. He suffered from constant illness, seizures, digestive problems, and infertility, which was unfortunate for a king whose entire job was to produce an heir. But no pressure, just the fate of Spain resting gently on his shoulders. The court doctors, doing their best with what they had, concluded that Charles was under a curse. Naturally, because the alternative explanation involved admitting that marrying within the same 5 people for 2 centuries might have consequences. They tried everything: exorcisms, relics, holy water, blessings. At no point did anyone suggest introducing a new gene into the situation. That would have been radical. Charles married twice. Neither marriage produced children, which shocked absolutely everyone who had been paying even minimal attention. By the time Charles died in 1900, at the age of 38, looking far older and far more tired than that, the Spanish Habsburg line was finished, extinct, quietly snuffed out by its own enthusiasm. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, all because a family couldn't stop marrying itself. So that was fun. But the Habsburgs were not alone. Oh no, they were simply the most committed. Let's gently float north, toward England, because the English monarchy, while slightly more subtle about it, still loved a good cousin. Take the Plantagenets, a sprawling dynasty with enough internal drama to fuel several centuries of civil war and at least 3 Shakespeare plays per relative. The Plantagenets intermarried with French nobility constantly, which at the time seemed reasonable. France was right there. Also, everyone vaguely important in Europe was related anyway, so why bother pretending otherwise? This led to a network so dense that by the 14th century, nearly every claim to the English throne was technically valid, which made succession complicated. Enter Richard II, a king who inherited the throne at 10 years old, because of course he did. Richard grew up surrounded by adults who were related to him in multiple ways and deeply interested in controlling him. He developed a strong belief in divine kingship and a mild intolerance for criticism, just mild. He married Anne of Bohemia, who was, surprise, also related. Their marriage was reportedly affectionate, which is nice. They didn't have children, which was less nice, politically speaking. When Anne died, Richard spiraled. He became erratic, paranoid, and increasingly detached from reality, which did not end well for him. He was eventually deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, because in medieval England, if you didn't like the king, you just checked the family tree and picked another one. Henry became Henry IV, and the cycle continued. This constant cousin-swapping of crowns didn't just create political instability, it also concentrated genetic issues. Royal children were often sickly. Many didn't survive infancy. Those who did survive were frequently described as frail, anxious, or prone to sudden emotional collapses, which again was blamed on curses, or God, or women, never the marriages. Let's pause here gently and talk about medieval royal children for a moment, because they had an absolutely terrible time. From birth, they were property. They were raised by servants. They were betrothed before they could read. Their bodies were political assets, and if they were weak or ill, it was considered a personal failure. Imagine being 7 years old, pale, constantly sick, and being told that the stability of the realm depends on you eventually producing strong sons. No pressure. Sleep well. Many royal children suffered from what we'd now recognize as genetic disorders, hemophilia, epilepsy, skeletal abnormalities. But medieval medicine had no language for this, so instead, children were bled, purged, prayed over, and sometimes quietly set aside. Which brings us to another famously inbred royal line, the Valois of France. The Valois kings were enthusiastic about keeping power close, very close. They intermarried with other French noble families repeatedly. This created a court culture obsessed with appearances and deeply terrified of weakness. One of the most famous Valois children was Charles IX. He became king at 10. Again, there's a pattern here. Charles was physically weak. He suffered from tuberculosis. He had violent coughing fits. He was emotionally unstable, and he was heavily influenced by his mother, Catherine de' Medici. Catherine, herself from a powerful Italian family, was determined to hold France together through sheer force of will and manipulation. She arranged marriages. She controlled councils. She micromanaged her children's lives. Charles grew up anxious, isolated, and increasingly paranoid. All right, settle back in. Nothing exciting is about to happen. Just more crowns slowly wobbling atop heads that probably shouldn't have been produced by the same four grandparents. When we last drifted off, Europe was still enthusiastically recycling its bloodlines and acting surprised when everyone looked tired. So let's continue, gently, into the early modern period, where powdered wigs got bigger, palaces got fancier, and the genetics did not improve. Let's float back towards Spain for a moment, because after the Habsburgs there burned out their line in spectacular fashion, Spain didn't suddenly learn a lesson. They simply married into a slightly different branch of the same family circle and hoped for the best. Enter the Bourbons, a French royal house that stepped in to rule Spain after Charles II kindly removed himself from the gene pool by dying childless. The Bourbons were related to the Habsburgs. Of course they were. Everyone was. Philip V of Spain was the first Bourbon king. He was the grandson of Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, which sounds impressive, and politically it was. Genetically, less so. Philip V suffered from severe mental health issues. He experienced long depressive episodes where he refused to eat, speak, or get out of bed. At other times, he was intensely anxious, paranoid, and convinced he was dying. Doctors were baffled. Courtiers were exhausted. Spain was governed by whoever happened to be standing nearest to the king when he was functional. Philip abdicated the throne at one point, citing exhaustion and illness, then changed his mind, because of course he did. He married twice. His first wife died young. His second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, was energetic, ambitious, and deeply invested in advancing her children's claims across Europe, which meant more strategic marriages. Their children married cousins, and those children married cousins, and so on. By the time we reach Ferdinand VI, Philip's son, the pattern has settled in nicely. Ferdinand was quiet, anxious, deeply melancholic. He depended heavily on his wife, Barbara of Portugal, who was also related to him because tradition. When Barbara died, Ferdinand collapsed emotionally. He became reclusive. He stopped governing. He wandered the palace at night, convinced he was haunted. He died a year later, childless. Spain, once again, quietly sighed and moved on to the next relative. Now let's drift north again, toward Austria, where the Habsburgs had regrouped and were still doing what they did best, marrying each other and hoping God wouldn't notice. Maria Theresa of Austria is often remembered as a strong ruler, and she was. She ruled for 40 years. She reformed the empire. She balanced politics like a professional plate spinner. But she was also a product of centuries of close kin marriage, and while she herself was relatively healthy, many of her children were not. Maria Theresa had 16 children. 16! Because if there's one thing royal families loved, it was quantity over quality. Many of these children suffered from chronic illness. Several died young. Others survived but struggled physically or emotionally. And then she married them off, strategically, relentlessly. Her daughters were sent across Europe like diplomatic packages, one to Naples, one to Parma, one to France. Yes, France, which brings us, gently, to Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was Maria Theresa's 15th child. She was sent to France at 14 to marry the future Louis XVI. She barely spoke French, she was terrified, and she was immediately scrutinized by a court that lived for gossip. Louis XVI was awkward, painfully shy, socially anxious, and physically uncomfortable in his own body. Their marriage was famously unconsummated for years. This caused endless speculation. Was it emotional? Was it physical? Was it stress? Was it perhaps the cumulative effect of generations of cousin marriage creating anatomical challenges? Historians have suggested everything from anxiety to a minor physical condition. Whatever the cause, the result was years of pressure, ridicule, and humiliation for both of them. Marie Antoinette, isolated and lonely, retreated into luxury and private social circles. Louis XVI retreated into locks and hunting manuals. Neither coped particularly well. Eventually, they had children, but by then, public opinion had soured, badly. We know how this story ends. Quietly, it does not. But what often gets lost is how emotionally ill-prepared both of them were. Raised as royal assets, married young, related to each other in multiple ways, and expected to carry the emotional weight of a nation. It's a miracle they functioned at all. Now, while Europe was busy tying itself into genetic knots, Britain was doing something slightly different, but equally questionable. Let's talk about Queen Victoria.
Victoria is often called the grandmother of Europe, and not in a cozy way. Victoria married her first cousin, Prince Albert. She adored him, truly. Their marriage was unusually affectionate for royalty. They had 9 children, 9, and through those children, Victoria spread hemophilia, a genetic blood disorder, into several royal houses. Hemophilia is carried on the X chromosome. Victoria was a carrier. She passed it to her daughters, who passed it to their sons. This meant royal boys across Europe were born with a condition that made even minor injuries dangerous. Bleeding wouldn't stop. Bruises became threats. Victoria's descendants included the royal families of Russia, Spain, and Germany, which meant hemophilia traveled far. In Russia, it reached the Romanovs. Enter Alexei Nikolaevich, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II. Alexei was born in 1904. He was cherished, protected, and constantly in danger. A fall, a bump, a bruise, any of these could be fatal. The royal family lived in quiet terror of his condition becoming public. They relied heavily on a mysterious healer named Rasputin, who seemed to calm Alexei's symptoms. This reliance damaged the monarchy's credibility. And again, no one blamed the family tree. They blamed fate, or mysticism, or enemies. By the time the Russian monarchy collapsed, the genetic weakness of the heir had become a symbol of the empire's fragility, a literal embodiment of centuries of closed-door marriage. And it didn't stop there. In Germany, Victoria's descendants included Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm was born with a withered arm, likely due to a traumatic birth exacerbated by genetic vulnerability. He grew up resentful, insecure, obsessed with strength and dominance. He overcompensated constantly. His physical condition became part of his identity, and not in a healthy way. Historians have long noted how Wilhelm's insecurity influenced his aggressive policies. It's not that genetics caused world events, but they didn't help. Let's take a slow breath here. Notice the pattern. Royal families marry within themselves to preserve power.
This concentrates genetic conditions, which creates sickly heirs, which destabilizes governance, which leads to chaos, which leads to historians politely saying things like, the situation deteriorated. And through it all, the people involved were often deeply unhappy. Queens trapped in foreign courts, kings raised without affection, children treated as future symbols rather than humans. Even when they lived in unimaginable luxury, their lives were rigid, anxious, and isolated. Now let's drift towards Scandinavia for a moment, because surely the cooler climate fixed everything. It did not. The Scandinavian royal families were also deeply interrelated with the rest of Europe. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, everyone married into everyone else. King Christian VII of Denmark is a good example. Christian VII suffered from severe mental illness. He exhibited erratic behavior, paranoia, and emotional instability. He married Caroline Matilda of Britain, his first cousin. She was young, alone, and deeply unhappy. Christian was unable or unwilling to fulfill his duties. Power shifted to advisors, including Johann Friedrich Struensee, who became both the de facto ruler and Caroline Matilda's lover. This did not end well for anyone. Christian lived much of his life sidelined, a king in name only, another ruler shaped by genetics, pressure, and isolation. By the 19th century, royal families were beginning to understand heredity, sort of. They noticed patterns, weakness, illness, mental instability. But tradition is heavy, and crowns are stubborn, so they kept going, because changing would mean marrying outside the circle, and that meant risking power. And for royalty, power was always the priority. As we gently prepare to drift onward, keep this image in mind. Grand palaces, gilded halls, lavish portraits, and behind them, children who never chose their roles, families who couldn't let go of control, and a continent quietly shaped by the consequences of marrying the same relatives over and over again. Next, we'll wander into the later 19th and early 20th centuries, where science begins to knock politely at the palace doors, and royalty pretends not to hear it. But for now, just rest, let your thoughts slow, and allow the long, quiet echo of dynastic decisions to fade into the background hum. All right, welcome back. Nothing has improved, but the furniture is nicer now and everyone owns more photographs. As we drift into the late 19th century, something subtle but deeply inconvenient begins to happen. Science shows up. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a gentle tapping on the palace door, holding a clipboard, politely suggesting that maybe, just maybe, marrying your cousin for the 7th time has consequences. Royal families naturally do not love this, because by this point, monarchy is less about conquering land and more about maintaining appearances, and appearances require continuity, which requires heirs, preferably heirs who can stand upright, speak clearly, and survive childhood. Let's start in Britain again, because Britain loved documentation. They wrote everything down, which means we can see the slow realization happening in real time. After Queen Victoria's reign, the royal family became increasingly aware that family traits were not always charming. By family traits, they meant things like hemophilia, spinal issues, anxiety, and a general sense that everyone needed a long lie down. Edward VII, Victoria's son, was physically healthier than many of his relatives, but he had his own coping mechanisms, namely indulgence. Edward ate heavily, drank heavily, socialized heavily. He was not particularly interested in governing, but after decades of waiting while his mother ruled forever, he was ready to enjoy himself. His marriage, like many royal marriages, was polite but distant. Affection was outsourced. This was common. Emotional fulfillment was not considered a royal responsibility. Edward's children were married strategically, still within elite circles, still often related. And then came George V. George V was steady, reserved, deeply committed to duty, and emotionally unavailable in a very British way. He married Mary of Teck. They were second cousins, which at this point was considered practically progressive. George and Mary had 6 children, and they raised them with strict discipline, emotional distance, and very high expectations. Their second son, Albert, later George VI, had a stammer, a severe one. Today, we understand speech impediments as neurological and developmental. At the time, it was considered a personal weakness. Albert was shy, anxious, terrified of public speaking, and constantly compared to his confident older brother Edward. This anxiety didn't appear out of nowhere. It lived in the family, it was reinforced by upbringing, and it was quietly exacerbated by generations of inherited sensitivity. When Edward VIII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, someone shockingly unrelated, Albert was forced onto the throne. He did his best, truly, but the stress nearly broke him. Which brings us to an important point. By the early 20th century, royal families were still producing heirs, but those heirs were increasingly fragile. Not in a dramatic way, just tired, anxious, overburdened. And now, let's gently return to continental Europe, where things were unraveling even faster. Austria-Hungary was a masterpiece of bureaucratic confusion and familial obligation. At its center was Emperor Franz Joseph I. Franz Joseph ruled for nearly 68 years. He outlived almost everyone he loved, which sounds tragic, and it was. His marriage to Elizabeth of Bavaria, better known as Sissy, was emotionally distant and deeply unhappy. They were cousins, naturally. Sissy struggled with depression, anxiety, and disordered eating. She avoided court life whenever possible. She traveled constantly. She exercised obsessively. She did not enjoy being an empress, and she did not enjoy being examined constantly by in-laws who shared her grandparents. Their son, Crown Prince Rudolph, was intelligent, sensitive, and deeply unhappy. Rudolph struggled with mental health issues. He felt trapped by expectations. He felt disconnected from his father, and he felt powerless within the rigid structure of the empire. In 1889, Rudolph died in a mysterious incident at Meierling. The official explanations were vague, deliberately so. Whatever the details, the result was clear. The heir was gone.
This shattered Franz Joseph and destabilized the line of succession. The empire limped forward until World War I finished the job. Again, no one blamed genetics. They blamed modernity, politics, fate. Now let's drift east again, back to Russia, because Russia never did anything halfway. The Romanovs had ruled for over 300 years. By the early 20th century, they were deeply intermarried with German and British royalty. Tsar Nicholas II married Alexandra of Hesse. She was Queen Victoria's granddaughter, which meant hemophilia. Alexandra was deeply anxious, highly religious, and intensely protective of her children. When their son Alexei was born with hemophilia, her fear became consuming. She withdrew from society. She clung to spiritual advisors. She trusted Rasputin not because she was foolish, but because she was desperate. Nicholas, meanwhile, was gentle, indecisive, and overwhelmed. He loved his family. He did not love ruling. He was not equipped for rapid industrialization, political unrest, or war. And his heir, fragile, bleeding, constantly at risk, became a symbol of everything the empire was trying to ignore.
By the time the Russian Revolution arrived, the monarchy was already emotionally exhausted. Their end was abrupt, but their decline was slow. And it followed the same pattern we've seen again and again: closed bloodlines, high pressure, emotional isolation, and denial. Now let's shift slightly to a place where monarchy tried to adapt: the Netherlands. The Dutch royal family also practiced cousin marriage, but by the late 19th century, they began to notice something was wrong. Queen Wilhelmina married Duke Henry of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. They were related, but there was concern. Their only surviving child, Juliana, was healthy, but fertility issues had already appeared. By the time Juliana became queen, advisors strongly encouraged marrying outside the traditional circles. She married Prince Bernhard of Lippe-Biesterfeld, still aristocratic, still elite, but less entangled. This was not entirely altruistic, it was practical, because by now doctors were quietly advising against close kin marriages. Genetics had a name, inheritance was understood, and the excuse of God's will was wearing thin. Some royal houses listened, others did not. Spain, for example, continued its tradition well into the 20th century. King Alfonso XIII married Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, Queen Victoria's granddaughter, which meant hemophilia returned to Spain. 2 of their sons suffered from it. One died young after a minor accident. The marriage deteriorated. The queen was blamed, because of course she was. Alfonso's reign ended in exile. The monarchy collapsed. Again. By now, the pattern was undeniable. Royal families that adapted, married more distantly, accepted constitutional limits, allowed modernization, survived. Those that clung to old practices quietly vanished. But even as monarchies fell, their descendants carried the legacy. Genetic conditions didn't disappear overnight. Mental health struggles lingered. Family trauma echoed. And yet, portraits remained serene. Official biographies stayed polite. History, when written by the powerful, has a way of smoothing things out. But if you look closely, past the crowns, the ceremonies, the uniforms, you see something else. You see children raised without softness, adults trapped by expectation, families afraid to change, and all of it wrapped in gold. As we drift closer to the present, royal families will finally begin to loosen their grip on tradition. They'll marry commoners, they'll seek therapy, they'll acknowledge illness. Sort of. But the long shadow of dynastic inbreeding doesn't vanish quickly. It fades, slowly, quietly, like everything else in royal history. So take a breath, let your thoughts wander. In our next stretch, we'll explore what happens when royal families finally open the doors and discover that freedom comes with its own complications. But for now, rest. The crowns are getting lighter, the bloodlines are thinning, and the world, at long last, is moving on.
All right, still here, still drifting. The crowns are lighter now, but the emotional baggage is very much intact. By the mid-20th century, monarchy had survived 2 world wars, several revolutions, and a slow, humiliating realization. Absolute power was out, public scrutiny was in, and science had opinions. Royal families, faced with extinction or adaptation, began doing something radical. They married people. Actual people, not second cousins, not dynastic chess pieces, just humans with jobs, opinions, and inconvenient independence. This did not go smoothly. Let's start with Britain again, because Britain documents discomfort better than anyone. George VI, having never wanted the throne, spent his reign managing anxiety, war, and the expectation to appear calm while internally panicking. His wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was not closely related to him. This was quietly revolutionary.
Their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, grew up in a household shaped by duty, restraint, and a very stiff upper lip. Elizabeth, the future queen, was trained from childhood to suppress emotion. Margaret, her younger sister, was not. Margaret was sensitive, expressive, and deeply frustrated by the limitations placed on her. She fell in love with Peter Townsend, a divorced man, which at the time was unacceptable. The monarchy, still clinging to moral authority, said no. Margaret complied, and never really recovered. She later married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a photographer, a commoner. Creative, charismatic. The marriage was unhappy. They divorced. This wasn't genetics. This was generations of emotional repression meeting modern expectations and failing to communicate. But the public, always eager for patterns, watched closely. And slowly, the idea took hold that royal dysfunction was not just inherited, it was learned. Now let's look at Scandinavia again, because Scandinavia adapted faster. Sweden, Denmark, Norway all began allowing marriages outside aristocracy. King Harald V of Norway famously married Sonja Haraldsson, a commoner. They had to wait years for approval. When it finally happened, the monarchy didn't collapse. The world didn't end. The bloodlines survived. In fact, public support increased because people saw something familiar: humanity. But the transition wasn't painless. Royal heirs raised under strict tradition suddenly found themselves in marriages that required emotional labor, which is a skill. Take Prince Charles, now King Charles III, a man shaped by expectation, emotional distance, and a childhood spent trying to please parents who valued restraint. He married Diana Spencer. She was aristocratic, but not closely related. She was young, emotionally open, and completely unprepared for royal life. Their marriage was a mismatch from the start. Charles sought understanding. Diana sought affection. Neither knew how to ask for what they needed. The result was public unhappiness, media obsession, and private breakdowns. This wasn't the result of inbreeding, it was the aftershock. Generations of emotional suppression don't vanish just because the gene pool widens. Now let's gently drift south again, back to Spain. After the monarchy was restored in the late 20th century, King Juan Carlos I married Queen Sofia of Greece and Denmark. They were related, because of course they were, but the relationship was distant, functional, political. Their son, Felipe VI, married Leticia Ortiz, a journalist, a commoner. This was modern Spain making a statement, and for a while, it worked. Felipe appears grounded, measured, emotionally present, which is not nothing. But even modern royal families struggle with legacy. Expectations linger, public pressure remains, and children raised under constant observation still carry weight most people never will. Now let's talk about Monaco, because Monaco is Monaco. The Grimaldi family managed to survive centuries by being flexible and dramatic. Prince Rainier III married Grace Kelly, an American actress, very unrelated. The marriage modernized Monaco's image, but behind the scenes, it was not a fairy tale. Grace struggled with loss of identity. Rainier struggled with control. Their children, Caroline, Albert, Stephanie, grew up in luxury and emotional chaos. Albert II eventually married Charlene Wittstock, an Olympic swimmer, not related. The relationship has been widely described as complicated. Again, genetics aren't the issue here. History is. Now let's pause gently. Because by this point, royal families are no longer producing visibly inbred heirs. The jaws have softened, the limbs function, the heirs speak, but the emotional consequences remain. Centuries of treating marriage as strategy didn't vanish overnight. Children were still raised for roles, not selves. Privacy was limited, choice was constrained, and mental health, while now discussed, was still stigmatized. Even today, royal families walk a careful line. They marry outside, they seek therapy, they modernize language, but they also maintain ceremony, hierarchy, and silence. Which brings us to a quiet truth. Inbreeding was never the only problem, it was just the most visible symptom. The real issue was control. Control over bodies, over marriages, over children, over futures. When that control loosened, genetics improved, but emotional freedom takes longer. As we drift toward the end of our long, sleepy journey, we'll reflect on what remains of monarchy today, who survives, who fades, and how the long echo of dynastic decisions still hums softly beneath modern crowns. But for now, breathe. Let the titles blur, let the portraits fade. The royal families are still here, just quieter, and finally, a little more human.